Elon Musk says the future is all about sustainable abundance. But what does that actually mean? And more importantly, how do we get there? Two of the most forward thinking minds on the planet, Tony Seba and James Arbib from RethinkX, just dropped a game changing book called Stellar. And it's not theory. This might be a blueprint for how we move from our dying extractive system to something radically more powerful. If you're a Tesla investor, this isn't just feel good talk. This is the economic engine behind Tesla's entire mission. And what they reveal in this book might just shift how you see what Tesla will do over the next 10 years. Let's break it down. We've got Cern Basher here with us today. Cern is a chartered financial analyst who's currently running his own investment advisory firm called Brilliant Advice, providing wealth management services. Welcome, Cern. Appreciate you joining me again.
Hi, Herbert. I think this is going to prove to be a very important book.
For who? And, humanity?
Well, for Tesla, for humanity, just for investors to understand the changes, I think, that are coming.
Okay, let's get going. There's a lot to cover here. You've got this book called Stellar by James Arbib. And of course, Tony Seba. These guys have just knocking out of the park. They've been predicting a lot of things they predicted have actually come true. So it's worthwhile when you listen to what they're saying. Yeah, what are we going to cover?
Yeah, this is a fairly short book, but there's a lot in it. If you just go to the next screen, this is on the webpage for their book. They say, what if every conflict, every inequality, and every environmental destruction that has taken place in the world has had the same single root cause? What if understanding that root cause could set us free, diverting humanity's path towards a new world beyond scarcity, conflict, or need? And they call that a stellar world.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like to kind of take our viewers kind of through this a little bit today. In the end, we're really only going to be able to scratch the surface on this, but hopefully I'll pique your interest enough that you'll want to dig in and read this book. So many people may know, particularly Tony Seba. And I'd just like to cover a couple things from Tony's past that I think just to remind viewers about Tony. Tony has been a very forward thinker, and he, along with James and Adam Dorr, are part of RethinkX. And Herbert, if you go to the next slide, here's some of the work that they've done. This is just four of many pieces that they've put together over the years. These are all excellent pieces to read. Many of them are available for free on RethinkX's website. And some of them are available for purchase on Amazon.
This is Rethink Energy, Transportation, Food and Agriculture, and of course, Humanity. And they've done one on humanoid bots as well. But Transportation has been a major, this was the one, and Energy, those two, they've just knocked it out of the park in their predictions for that.
Yeah, and just to remind people sort of the success that Tony's had. So if you go to the next page, in 2014, he predicted this, or showed this curve for the cost of batteries for vehicles, basically. And he was spot on. Mm-hmm. Everybody at the time was thinking there might be some kind of linear decline in the battery costs. And he was saying, no, it doesn't work that way. It's going to be on this cost curve. And so he got that exactly right. I'm not aware of anybody else that was right about that. And again, this is over 10 years ago now, right, when battery costs were much higher. So he got that right. And then he's also done some work just on how disruptions happen on the next slide. And this is just some work they did on the history of adoption of vehicles. And basically from 1910 to 1920, in that 10-year period, we went from having about 10% vehicle ownership, or 11% there, to 81% in just 10 years. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't just about replacing the horse with the vehicle. It was about building whole new industries and whole new structures in the world, new roads. And at the same time, we were involved in World War I. There was a pandemic as well. So, mm-hmm. not unlike current times in terms of other challenges going on at the same time. And so Tony's work on this, I think, has been pretty fascinating. And on the next slide, just putting some numbers to it, Tony's suggested that these kinds of transformations look like an X, where the rise of one is kind of mirrors the fall of the other. Mm-hmm. And in the case of the car versus the buggy, it wasn't like cars just replaced the horse and the buggy. And that chart there on the right, the car market became far, far larger than the buggy market ever was.
There you go.
right?
Mhm.
And that's typical of these kinds of disruptions. So it wasn't just understanding the speed of the disruption, but just the mechanics of them and how they work. And so Tony, I think, is the leading authority on disruptions. He says that they've looked at about 1,500 different disruptions. And so on the next slide is just 8 of them.
Mhm.
The change in insulin, in physical to digital video, physical film to digital cameras there on the top right, and so on. So example after example follows this same X curve. Okay, so if you're not familiar with Tony's work, I strongly encourage you to take a look at that. Go to Rethink X's website, and you can download many of their works. Okay, so one of the things that Tony again showed us that there is this this virtuous cycle for things, and it works in reverse when something is being replaced. And so the speed of the changes usually far exceeds or is much faster than anybody thinks. And there's actually, well, I'll show you, it says on the next page here, in May of 2010, Tony stuck his neck out and he said, I expect solar costs to drop 80 to 90% over the next decade. And basically at that point, people were laughing at him. They didn't think that
Mhm.
this was possible.
Mhm.
And he absolutely nailed that, right? And one of the things since then on the next slide, conventional forecasts for the adoption of solar look like the chart there on the left. The International Energy Agency, I believe, makes predictions about these
Yeah,
things every year. And you can see the lines, and the green line is what actually happened.
yeah.
And then in the next year they make a prediction, and it's always like a linear change, and they've always been
They
wrong.
just they'll never learn, right? They go, okay, I think
Never
it's
learn.
gonna look like this. Actually, it's gone
Yeah,
up this way. Okay, then I'll make a straight line after that dot.
that's right. Right.
Just
And
don't
then the
learn.
same thing on the disruption of coal. Again, linear, even optimistically flat or up,
Yeah.
and yet it's on this decline on this curve. So even though Tony's been out there talking about this for years now, the industry still doesn't get it.
Can we pause for a sec? I mean, so these are predictions of new disruptive technologies. If you can bring it back to me for Tesla, what does it mean for Tesla? What are the industries you think that we're disrupting and that people are completely misunderstanding?
Yeah, there's two major ones, Herbert. There's the energy business with Tesla and their battery storage products that are solidly sort of in line to benefit from this, and we'll get into that a little bit deeper in a minute. And then, of course, the big one is autonomous vehicles and autonomous humanoid robots. And those two technologies are going to allow what Tony and James call stellar technologies.
Mm.
On the energy side, stellar energy, and so on. So it's quite fascinating, sort of how the picture that they're painting of what the future world might look like, and it's very similar to the sustainable abundance idea that Elon's been talking about.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So this is a couple of years ago now, and Tony's saying that solar is now the cheapest source of energy ever,
Hmm.
solar and wind. And there's a funny comment in one of his videos. He says, cost curves are like gravity. I don't care what anyone's opinion on gravity is. These things can be predicted.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's right to be a little bit smug about this because, again, he was exactly right. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about energy just in general, and again, just bringing this back to Tesla. There's a lot in this chart. If we start on the top left, we've got declining cost curves of solar. We've got a declining cost curve of wind. We've got a declining cost curve in batteries. So every year,
Mm.
these technologies get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper.
Mm.
Okay. And so, for example, batteries, we had an 87% drop in cost from 2010 to 2020, and
Mm.
predicting another 80% drop from 2020 to 2030. Right. So pretty amazing in terms of declining costs. So it's pretty hard for any other technology to compete against something that has the cost declining that rapidly. Okay, so you take the combination of solar, wind, and batteries, and you can build a new energy system. And on the bottom left, so he's created what he calls the clean energy U curve. And he says there's a nonlinear trade-off between the generation and storage of energy. So if you have a combination of solar and wind and combine that with battery storage, you can get generating capacity that's 2, 3, 4x. And at 4x, actually, that's your lowest cost system. So you can build a system that's 4x the generating capacity of today's systems. And that's the lowest cost system that you can build. But if we skip up to the chart there on the top right, for an incremental 20% investment, you can get 200 to 300% higher power or energy. So he's saying this is kind of the superpower of energy in terms of you can have super abundant, near zero marginal cost energy with these types of systems. And the beautiful thing about these systems is that once they're in place, once you've made that investment, solar and batteries, for example, they might be in place for 30, 40, 50 years with some maintenance, but they don't have the same kind of ongoing costs that traditional energy systems do. Okay. And again, more details on this work is available on Rethink X's website. I'm going through this pretty fast intentionally in order to kind of lay the groundwork for his book, his most recent book. But this is the area that again Tesla Energy is participating in, right? By providing energy storage systems that are allowing the world to build more and more super abundant energy resources and get to this world of superpower that Tony talks about.
Cern, is it your mind that even if the prices of batteries fall, therefore the prices of Tesla's megapack factories fall, it becomes more commoditized, but just like you showed earlier, the TAM for it, the market where it's available, just skyrockets. Like all of a sudden, we have AI data centers. Now, every single sovereign will want it. Every country, every company will want their own data center. Therefore, that just explodes. And so at the end of the day, it's still going to be a very explosive business for Tesla.
Yeah, you might have something like 1,000x increase in demand, but maybe from a pricing standpoint, because prices come down, it might end up being 100x opportunity in revenue. Something like that, just rough numbers in terms of, the market opportunity is huge, but pricing is going to come down pretty steeply.
Exactly. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. Again, this chart has a lot to it, but if we just focus on the one on the right with the 2 red arrows. So they're saying that, and this is an example for California. Okay. So if you had 100% solar, wind, and battery system, it could naturally produce a huge surplus of clean energy at near zero marginal cost. Okay. And if you look at those 2 red lines, we're in relation to the little blue boxes beneath. So existing demand can meet the electric power needs, right, as it is now. But as you add lower cost solar, wind, and batteries, you can start meeting the needs of transportation. You can start meeting the needs of residential, commercial, and then industrial. Right. And with it, just again, with the 20% extra investment, you get to, in the case of California, 100 to 200% extra power. So it just makes a lot of sense. So over time, the marginal cost of power goes way down, and you have this abundance of energy. Okay. And again, Tony's done a lot of work on this for different parts of the world, whether it's Germany, whether it's California, Texas, Alaska, India. He's got examples for all those regions. Okay. Okay. So in the next chart, if we focus on disruption and change, you've got a current system that's in some kind of steady state. And then you've got something that sort of causes a rupture in the system, either new technology or a problem. And then you go through what Tony calls a phase change. And there's a rapid change in that system. And so that's what we're seeing now already in the energy business. And we're also starting to see that now with electric vehicles. And then if you add on autonomy on top of that, that will definitely accelerate the adoption of electric vehicles. Okay. On the next chart, the same idea can also be applied to civilizations. Okay, so now we're starting to get into some of the content of this book. So over time, initially we had hunter and gatherers. And actually, if you just go to the next table, maybe this is a better way to look at it. You've got on the left side, hunter and gatherers. They've got, clay, mud bricks. They farm plants. There's food storage and processing. not really much in the way of energy or transport or information, right? And they've got, the emergence of things like private property, barter trade, wealth transfer, and fortification. Once you start farming and have things that you are keeping around, you have to protect that wealth. So you start to need to fortify it and secure it. And so as we go along, each civilization is developing new technologies, right? And there's differences and advancements in each. And the key thing to take away from this table is that you need different organizing system to go with these new technologies,
Mm-hmm.
right? It wasn't like we always had a Supreme Court. We had to develop that because we had a need for a Supreme Court. It wasn't like we always had the patent system. We needed to develop that, right? Because new technology sort of forced us to think about how to deal with some of these things. And so these are examples sort of throughout time of the new things that needed to be developed in terms of the organizing system. Okay, so what Tony and James are now saying is that because we've got these new technologies coming, the superabundance of energy and a superabundance of labor, AI and humanoid robots, we're going to need entirely new systems in order for this to work for humanity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's just a fact of life. We've done this before throughout time. We've developed new systems to meet these challenges, and we will have to again this time around. We're not just going to slot these things into the current system. If we do, there's going to be some massive ruptures in that system that will force change. And we'll get into the details a little bit more on this in a second. Now, on the next slide, the risk is this. It's not always a stair step up. Okay, as you go through civilizations throughout time, sometimes there are some steps backwards. And so this is what we have to be particularly careful of to guard against taking massive steps backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And this is possible if people don't understand what's happening. Okay, and we'll dive into that a little bit deeper in a minute. But just again, just a stylized version of this chart, it's not always straight up. Okay.
Very
Okay.
interesting. Okay.
Let's skip this one just in the interest of time. Okay. Apologize for the fuzziness of this chart, but it's taken from the book. So when you have a system that's stable, making a big change is really hard. And his image here is this rock in this valley. Pretty hard to move the rock. But if you have an unstable system, then big change is inevitable because all you have to do is push that rock and it's going to roll down the hill.
Mm-hmm.
So you need this rupture point. And he's suggesting that we've reached a few rupture points. And I'll share why here in a second. But first of all, the good news on the next page. Tony talks about these foundational sectors, right? This clean superabundance of energy trending to near zero cost.
Wow. Yep.
But also transportation. Autonomous vehicles will also allow the same thing, again, driven on the back of energy costs going down to zero. He also talks about that with food, and precision fermentation is one example he talks about there. And of course, another one that we're all familiar with is AI. AI is going to bring the marginal cost of intelligence and trend that towards zero as well.
Mm-hmm.
And then labor. You put AI into a humanoid bot, and suddenly you're going to take labor costs and trend those towards zero. Right. So just on the surface of that, these 5 things are absolutely foundational to everything that we do. So if you can drive down the cost of all these things down to zero, you're talking about massive, massive disruption and change in the world that we're going to have to adapt to. And it's like Tony's statement about gravity. I don't care what your opinion on gravity is. This is coming. We're going to be forced to deal with this in terms of the implications to our political system, to our society, basically everything.
Does he
Right?
give
If we
you a
think,
time frame of what we're talking about here? Are we talking 5 years? Or are we talking about 50 years?
well, Tony's work tells us that it usually happens faster than we think. Right? If we have this linear thinking, we say, "Oh, it's going to be a while before autonomous vehicles take over the world." In reality, it'll probably happen a lot quicker.
Yes.
In this most recent work, he doesn't offer any timeframes around that specifically. But again, just taking the lessons from his previous studies, these things tend to happen fairly quickly. Okay, and of course, some of these are building on each other, so it could happen even faster. Okay. Okay, let's step back in time again a little bit. So we've got, just to simplify things, we've got the hunter-gatherers, let's say 10,000 years ago. And then we've got the Sumerians 5,000 years ago, and we've got the modern American. And Tony uses this example of the three of them walking into a bar. And it's not a
Mm-hmm.
joke,
Mm-hmm.
right? But the point here is that the Sumerians and the Americans would have a lot in common to talk about. We have some fancy technology, but they had government. They had class system. They had, money, debt, and wealth, right? They had money and credit. They had
Yeah.
private ownership. They had all these things that we have 5,000 years ago. They
Mm-hmm.
had beer. They could have actually had beer in the bar, right? So the hunter gatherer wouldn't have had a clue what these other two guys would be talking about, right? All these conversations about all these things on this page, the hunter gatherer would have had no concept of any of this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But Tony's suggesting that civilization's on the cusp of another transformation.
Mm.
Okay. And so if he's right, then this is definitely worth thinking about, because this is big stuff, because if these transformations happen every 5,000 years, then, we better
We're on
be
the
prepared
cusp.
for it.
Yeah, this
Yeah,
is where Elon has been repeating, I don't even know what money means at that point.
that's right.
Like, do we even need money anymore?
Yeah. And Tony's answer is no.
Yikes.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So
No money needed.
so
Yeah.
yeah, let's dive into this a little
Yeah.
bit more and build a bit more of a foundation before we go there.
All right. Wonder,
So on the
we
next
need to be a
page,
democracy or we're going to become a socialist communist country again. you know.
yeah. And I
Oh,
think Tony adds some important sort of work, or extends some of our thinking on this in a nice way. So we'll cover that. So he's saying that the Neolithic revolution from 12,000 years ago, right, was a catalyst for extraordinary change. It was a complete transformation of the way humans lived.
mhm.
Okay, so farmers went from no longer just grazing on the earth, but they actually extracted, harnessed, and shaped the earth. They farmed, right? So the planet and their labor became inputs into a production system. And that's what that little chart there on the right is trying to show you. They took people, they took land, resources, put it through this production system, and extracted output from it. Okay. Some of the outputs were useful, like food that they consumed. Some of the outputs were surplus that they could then save and use later. Right. And there were also toxic outputs, like when you burn stuff, you release toxins and that kind of thing. So there's good outputs and bad outputs. Okay. Now, because they were farming and they now had a life that was more grain based, they had a more settled lifestyle. Higher fertility led to a population explosion. Population explosion was more labor, so that was great. They could put more labor through the system and get more work done. But it also created a growth imperative, right? Because growing populations require more land and resources, right? And so now you look at your neighbor and say, "Oh, his land's more productive than mine. I'm going to go take it."
Exactly.
This new system created conflict where before there wasn't any.
Mm-hmm.
Hunter gatherers weren't fighting each other for the right to, go kill a saber-toothed tiger, right? Most of the time, they probably never even saw other people other than their small family group. But now we've created a system where conflict is actually kind of innately built into it, because you'll be more successful if you can gather more land and resources and people for yourself. Okay. So it's kind of interesting, right? The economic system that we find ourselves in today, and its wars and conflicts, is part and parcel
Built
of the
in.
system.
Part of the system. Yep.
Yeah. So again, just to make a finer
Mm-hmm.
point on the next slide, Tony says, or maybe it was James said, either you grow or you get outgrown. You exploit or you get exploited.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So because of the system, now we needed military forces to protect supplies of food and stores of wealth. And if people were willing to work, weren't willing to work, they had to be coerced into doing so. So more people equals more power. Therefore, you have the rise of slavery too. Right. And then, of course, we had toxic outputs from the system, which is pollution, waste, environmental damage, inequality. Again, this is part of the system, exploitation, and privilege. So a lot of the problems that we see today are part and parcel of the economic system that we have developed for ourselves because we've moved from hunter-gatherers to this, people that can farm and so on and gather resources and build things.
It's interesting that this is economic at the top, because a lot of people they assume and they think that economics is actually what drives society and governance. You follow where the money goes, and that's how things happen. This is
Yeah, I think in many ways they're all certainly related. And of course, we've also experimented with other forms of governance, whether it's capitalism and communism and that type of thing, right? So,
Mhm.
c- you know, capitalism has been the winner, um, but it's not perfect. You get all these other outputs from capitalism, right? Because in a competitive environment, you're kind of forced to exploit. That's kind of part and parcel of the system. Okay. Um, this relates actually to the next slide. Yeah, this one. So in extraction, so Tony calls this extraction, this new form of structure that we have for our society. It's an extractive society, right? We're extracting labor, we're extracting resources from the earth. And he's saying it doesn't pay to maintain a sustainable or equitable
Or
society,
equitable society.
right? That's not needed
Mhm.
in extraction. If you want to be the most powerful city state, you need to get as much out of your people as you can, slave
Mhm.
labor if you have to, get as much out of the land as you can, right? In order to beat to beat the next city state or next country. So scarcity leads a drive for ruthless efficiency in order to make the most of limited inputs, and then worrying about longer term inputs only compromises growth, right? And gives you an advantage to your rivals. So this is why we've had environmental degradation. Sorry, hard for me to say. Over many, many centuries, because the natural impetus here is to get as much out of the resources that you have at your disposal. But it also creates inequality, inflation, conflict, right? They're all inherent to extraction, and they're all features. They're not bugs of the system. It's a feature of this system. Okay. Now,
Mhm.
what we've learned to do on the next slide is find some balance. And this is what we look to our political leaders for, right? And so if you have too much stability in the system, you don't have enough growth. If you have too much growth in the system, then you lose control and it gets out of whack. So we've got these counterbalancing forces that we've developed in our society to try to maintain the quote unquote the right amount of growth, right? And this is where some of the political conflict of the day comes in, right? We'll get to that a bit more in a second. But and again, we're no longer just growth at all costs. We do have some counterbalancing forces, but still we're in this competitive environment against other nations, whether it be USA versus China or other countries. We're still locked in this kind of battle. Okay. All right. And then again, just one image on this from the book. He calls it the Gordian knot of extractive problems. Right. Conflict and polarization and environmental issues, exploitation of people, inequality, genocide, slavery, all this stuff, it's all related to the system
Mhm.
that we have. Okay. All right.
Mhm.
And then finally, this extractive production system today is one where you've got the same inputs going in, and then we've now created a lot of wealth that's generally controlled by what he calls core elites. Just a few people at the top have most of the wealth. You've got a government that kind of oversees things that generally is to the benefit of the core group, but they have to keep the workers happy enough so that they don't rebel and upset the entire system,
Yeah.
right? And James says up until now, workers have always had kind of a say in the system because the elites needed the workers' labor. But now think about what
Mm.
happens if you no longer need people's labor, right? If you can just
Mm.
build it in the form of a robot, suddenly then the average person's voice is, they have less power, I guess is what I'm trying to say, potentially. Okay? Because if you don't need labor anymore, if you can just manufacture it, then so there's some serious risks here.
Yeah, how do we get to abundance for all, which is what
Yeah,
Elon keeps talking about? If the same system continues to grow, it's a core group will be once mostly abundant, and then maybe there's no need for keeping that people happy. Ah,
that's right.
okay.
Yeah. Now the core group, I guess, still runs the risk of the masses, storming the castle
Rebelling.
with pitchforks.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And if you're
Okay.
protected by bots.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
That's right. So here's what they call the stellar energy system, right? So you take solar, wind, and batteries. You form this energy system that, once it's built, only needs input from the sun. You don't have to keep feeding it with resources, natural resources. Now, it's not entirely perfect because there's maintenance and there's things you have to rebuild over time. But for the most part, you can get to the system that produces a lot more output than what's going in. It'll create a lot more surplus at very low cost. And they're suggesting that the toxic outputs stop, or at least get minimized.
Which is
Okay.
great news. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So that's kind of the system that we want to move towards. We're moving from this extraction-based system to what they call stellar. And one key output from this, and again, this relates to Tesla as well, is with what they call artificial labor. It's the combination of AI and humanoid robots. They call it AL, artificial labor. They suggest that we can free ourselves from labor and from being an input into the system. So now the system works for us rather than us working for the system.
Mhm.
And what that means, again, as we talked about earlier, it means that we need different political, economic, and societal structures.
Wow.
Just like we did in the past, we needed to develop all those things we have today, but now we have to develop whole new structures for this new system. And this is the challenge now for humanity over the next decade or two. Okay. Now, one of the things that they talk about is, if you go to the next slide, because our organizing systems need to adapt, they have different needs. So, for example, just in that top paragraph, because the technology is so different, the properties, like, for example, collaboration confers an advantage rather than competition,
Oh, good. Okay.
right? And they say if we shoehorn stellar technologies into old organizing structures, we're in a dystopia. It's like sticking wings on a caterpillar and expecting it to fly,
Mm.
right? We'll get other problems. So, for example, Jamie says we would see rampant inequality where a handful of people in Silicon Valley or in China essentially own the world's labor.
Yep.
So it could be the most unequal society humanity's ever seen. So, for example, if, let's say, Tesla wins the robotic race and Tesla controls the market, then you could have a situation where, at least in the United States or in the Western world, you've got one company that controls all the labor. And I think Jamie's quite right to point out here that potentially could be a major problem. And I think Elon recognizes this because he's made comments in the past about robotaxi, that they want to be able to sell those vehicles to people so that people can make a living off of them. And I think we'll see the same thing with the robots. Even though from a financial modeling perspective, when I run the numbers, it would be far better and more profitable for Tesla to own everything. But that's exactly what Jamie's warning about here, is that kind of situation. And I think that could be a problem. Okay. On the right side is a list of what they're calling stellar technologies. So you've got AI and robotics for Tesla, that's Optimus. You've got solar, wind, and batteries for Tesla, Tesla Energy. And then there's some other technologies that are part of that. The key thing about these is that many of them are decentralized, right? So you can build, for example, you can put solar on your roof. You don't need necessarily anybody's permission to do that. So part of the trend here is that people individually can make these choices and move us towards this new stellar world. And interestingly, too, I'll just mention that he's got blockchain listed there. You really should just mean Bitcoin, but that's also a decentralized form of money or store value.
Mhm.
So that's all related to this as well. And Tony and Jamie mentioned that briefly in their book. They don't go into a lot of detail about that, but I think it's an important component. Their message is that our organizing systems need to adapt and quickly. The last phase change took thousands of years. They're suggesting this phase change could be tens of years, right? And we're on the cusp of it now. As Tesla's looking to roll out the robotaxi network, that's the first phase in terms of having unlimited labor. And then once you have autonomous robots and not just vehicles with wheels, but robots that move around and walk and can do stuff, then this really kicks off this idea of abundant labor, and that changes the world very quickly. Okay. Okay. So again, just to highlight a couple of things here, in our current system, we have capitalism, and it's an extraction engine that has no ethics.
Yeah.
Okay. The fault doesn't rely with capitalism. The fault relies with political leadership that maybe hasn't tempered the ruthlessness of capitalism. They certainly have tried, but not always effective. There's definitely people that have been left behind. Now, democracy has been the most effective way for societies to maximize growth. That's true. Okay. But Tony suggests that in practice, it still protects interests of the core elites.
True.
It's done little more than create an illusion of inclusion, facade of consensus, while the modern day elites still hold all the levers of power.
True.
Okay. And then the welfare system, right? We've built this welfare system, form of taxation, subsidies, rules and regulations, right? They're all tools to redirect the flow of resources to try to offset inequality and other toxic outputs in the system, right? So the final point there is that if you look at the governments today, it's been a delicate balancing act, and it defines the split between left and right and the polarity of positions on every issue, from redistribution to workers' rights to immigration to taxing, either big government or versus small, companies, or if you want a big government that's more stable, or if you want to pursue more growth, you have different tax policy. And then, of course, environmental issues, and then whether the government spends on science and innovation. All these issues that we fight about today are because of the system that we have in place.
Yeah, I like the way that they describe this: capitalism, democracy, welfare. I do think this is a very good, explanation of where we're at today, and just very curious what's going to happen. But yeah, it's actually not perfect what we have today.
Far from it. It's maybe better than every other option that we've tried, but it's far from perfect. Yeah. So, what are the implications then of this stellar system, as they call it? So, one of the things that's kind of interesting, and when you first hear this, it sounds a bit controversial and it might sound a bit like communism. But if you actually think about it for a little bit, it kind of makes sense. And this will be something that I'll be thinking about a lot more in the coming days and weeks and months. But this idea of private ownership and free market capitalism actually may not be necessary once you get to a stellar system. It's very necessary to get us there. But the point that they make is that private ownership, for example, could become a disadvantage because it adds cost in the form of a return required on the capital that you invest. Right? So if I'm going to invest $1 billion in something, I want a return on that capital. But what happens if I'm competing against a nation state that invests $1 billion on behalf of its people that's not demanding a return on that capital? And now they build a productive system that's more productive than what I could build because I require a return on my money. Right? So you can easily see over time market forces sort of pushing down, and reducing returns on investments. So that's kind of an interesting concept, and there's a lot, I think, to unpack there at some point. The other thing I think that's really interesting is supply and demand economics, right? We all understand supply and demand, but it breaks down in a world where supply is boundless, regardless of what the demand is. We've never lived in that world before. But if you have unlimited labor, unlimited intelligence, unlimited energy, therefore unlimited supply of all those things, where's the pricing curve on that? Well, it's close to zero at whatever demand is. So what that means is the metrics that we use to measure economic activity, whether they're individual metrics like salary, income, and wealth, or collective metrics like GDP, debt, and productivity for a nation, they won't serve any purpose. You're not measuring anything that's valuable anymore, right? And that's kind of profound to think about, right? And then this whole thing that we're going through today with protectionism and trade and tariffs, right? That serves no purpose anymore because everyone will have everything they need. So there's some profound potential changes at work here. And then, of course, welfare systems, again, protecting people. So the current measures that we have to redistribute wealth, such as taxation, minimum wage, and even ideas like universal basic income, are redundant in this world. Because as you mentioned earlier, Herbert, what is money? You don't need it. And then further
Wait,
to that, the
yeah, keep
beliefs
on.
and values that underpin our religions, and these are quotes from the book, cultures and
Mhm.
social constructs that favor conformity and blind faith and that drive us to work harder and to make sacrifices in the name of growth may also fade away
Interesting.
because we don't need to
Whoa,
work for growth anymore.
whoa. Okay, so wait, there's so much there. Okay,
Yeah.
so wait. So first of all, Elon has said a few times that it's not going to be just universal basic income. It'll be universal. Uh, what do you say? Abundant income,
Universal high income, I think, is what
high
he used.
income,
Yeah.
universal high income. Meaning that you're going to get a lot, but that
Yeah.
still gives the idea that I'm going to get cash. I'm going to get cash, and then I don't have to work. I don't have to spend. I don't need a salary or income or wealth because the bots will do all the work. AI will do all the work. But don't worry, you're going to get cash. And if I do get cash, I can get access to any supply that I want. But then, if supply is abundant, more abundant, if anytime I want a bike, I can get a bike. It doesn't have to cost me $100. It can cost me $1. Maybe I don't even need money anymore. Maybe it's a shared ownership and there's 1,000 bikes sitting there. 100, I can grab a bike anytime I want and nobody's going to charge me anything.
Yeah. I
Um,
mean, if you can walk into the grocery store and take whatever food you want, then you don't need cash for that.
yeah.
Right. If there are things that are still scarce, then I suppose you might need some form of money for those items. Right. Like not everybody can live, in a mansion on the ocean. Right. There
Yeah, I
are
guess
there are
I'm
going to
just
be.
confused with the universal high income that
Yeah.
Elon's talking about versus you don't even need money, which
Right.
he also talked about.
Yeah. Now, Jamie and Tony do talk about the transition here, and there is some role for universal basic income to cushion the blow for people as we make this transition.
Hmm, gotcha.
So it's not just, go from one system to the other cold turkey, and there's people that suffer in the middle and we don't care about them. No, we have to be very thoughtful about how we bring everybody from our current system into potentially a new system could look very different.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So then maybe there's universal high income that takes us to the world where money's not even relevant anymore. That's like
Yeah.
the far future. Okay. But
And
boy,
again,
this idea
in this
that,
book,
yeah,
they kind of scratched just the surface on these items, and Tony does mention that they're going to go into more detail about some of these things.
can you
Um,
imagine? Yeah.
yeah,
Religions, cultures, and social constructs. You're right. Like, if you really think about it, a lot of our society is built on you must be a productive worker and you
yeah,
must just listen to what I say. And I need to don't waste time if playing around and I need you to work. And then this whole religion is always about this blind faith, right? Just believe me or whatever law I
mhm.
put in place, because that's how you get people to be productive and just follow along. But now maybe you don't need that. Yeah,
And our whole
very
educational system too is kind of around that, right? Yeah.
well. Yeah, then maybe you don't even need to be educated. AI
Well,
is
it
there,
looks very
take
different.
care of you.
You might just be able to follow your passions rather than being forced to learn certain things certain ways and
Curriculum.
pass tests and so on. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Oh
It was
man,
a- it
this
was
is
designed to produce productive workers, basically, which the system demanded. The system needed that, and that's what we did, and that made economic sense for us to do it that way. But
mhm.
in a new world where humans are no longer the productive labor, we're not part of that production cycle anymore, then our role suddenly is very different. And therefore, the things that we need to do as humans also look very different, particularly from an education level. Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay.
Yeah. The repercussions here are profound. One of the ideas is that we might want to have more things that are productive goods. So, for example, humanoid labor, right? It's a little scary to think that you might have just a few people controlling all humanoid labor in the world. Now, certainly as shareholders in Tesla, that's kind of exciting in terms of the value of our investment. But just taking a step back and looking at all of humanity, not everybody's going to be a shareholder in Tesla. And this idea of public goods, right? And so is labor then a public good? Right. I'm kind of jumping to my question there in blue, but should AI and artificial labor be a public good, just like the internet is today, just like knowledge is today? The highway system, national defense, streetlights, clean air, and water. Those are all public goods, right? And so we do have some things that we have today that we treat as a public good. We didn't let anybody own the internet. Should we be letting anybody own AI? Will that happen? Do we have to worry about that? Perhaps. Do we have to worry about somebody owning all of it, artificial labor? Perhaps. And again, as Tesla shareholders, that's kind of exciting. But from a total humanity point of view, that may not be the best approach. Now, one of the things that Tony and Jamie talk about in the book is this idea of allowing a return on capital for a period of time. So if you go to the next slide, we have a patent system,
Right.
right, that allows people to innovate and encourages innovation. They have to tell us what that innovation is. It gives other people a chance to build on it. It rewards the inventors for a period of time, and it kind of balances, public and private interests. So that's kind of interesting idea. Do we employ that idea a little bit more broadly, perhaps with some of the new technologies and innovations that we have? Now, it's also really interesting from Elon's perspective. His quote here is, "Patents are for the weak. They're used like landmines in warfare. They don't actually help advance things. They just stop others from following you." And we already know that Tesla has made their patent portfolio freely available to many people on the EV side, right? And so Elon's kind of enlightened about this already. By the way, on the right side, those were some actual patents filed for a combination toy dog vacuum cleaner, for a TV control device, looks like a long stick, the Apple flip phone there on the bottom left. And then if you are a chef, the anti-eating face mask, so you weren't tempted to eat any of the food that you made. Bit Silence of the Lambs-esque, but
Sure.
we've people have filed patents for all kinds of crazy stuff. So anyway, but this is an interesting idea, I think, as it relates to, we want to reward innovation, but do you really want to be creating natural monopolies, right? And this, this is a role for politicians to sort through this.
Well, at some point, AI is going to be the main driver of innovation, the main driver of new technologies, the idea generator. And
Yeah.
then if the AI did it, is it my AI that did it? So therefore I get money out of it? Or should it be something that everybody benefits out of it? Yeah.
And I think we've already sort of seen this, like AI is training on everybody's information, everybody's content. And so then shouldn't I automatically own part of that AI because it was training on my content?
Mhm.
Is it fair that AI is learned based on humanity's collective knowledge and now somebody gets to own that knowledge? All right. So these are some interesting, big questions about how we treat these AI systems from an economic perspective. Yeah. Without discouraging innovation. So Tony says this, in sort of, this idea of guiding humanity to the stellar world. He says, we don't need 200 countries to do this. We don't need 8 billion people to agree. We don't need a centralized United Nations top-down way of doing this. What we need is
Mhm.
somebody somewhere, like every other disruption in history, to make it happen, and then it spreads. What we need is 5 or 10 smaller societies on the edge of incumbency. I don't think it's going to happen first in the US or Europe, These are the centers of incumbency, right? We have a lot to lose, and so we're less
Gotcha.
likely to
Be the
push
ones.
these changes. But there are some other smaller nations, perhaps, that could leapfrog other nations if they did this first.
Gotcha.
So that's what he's seeing in terms of potential there. I do think the U.S. certainly has a role to play in terms of developing the technologies, but will we as a nation develop everything else around the technologies to truly allow our society to flourish in the way that Tony thinks it could?
Yeah, the only issue would be that humanoid robots are basically centered right now in the US or in China. So they are the incumbency, but they're the ones creating the most and has the most money, the most power to be able to control these top stellar technologies. And it's up to them to decide if they want to let another smaller country to have access to it.
That's right. So there's definitely some risks there in terms of taking these new technologies and just fitting into this current extraction model economy that we have. But if there is another nation that can find a way to develop their own and not be constrained by some of the things that we self-constrain ourselves with now in terms of, making a profit, for example, is one issue here in the US, right? If there's other nations that are not so worried about that, then they could suddenly become more competitive than we are, which would then force our hand to change our systems in order to address that. Yeah. So on the next slide, this is kind of one of their final points, is that at an individual level, that extractive individuals won't bring about a stellar society, right? So on the left side there, they sort of show the extractive emotions, right? And I think all of us would recognize many of these and many of them in ourselves from time to time. And they're suggesting on the right side that these are stellar emotions. And so humans are capable of both. So this whole notion of that humans are always, we hoard, or we are reactive, we are distracted, we have hate and envy and fear. Some of those emotions come from the system that we find ourselves in. And if we didn't have that system anymore, then we might be able to be more on the right side. And so Tony is saying that in order for us to get to this new stellar world, we as individuals also have to make a shift. And we have to become aware of these two different sets of emotions. And then the final slide, Herbert, is just to kind of put a bow on that idea, is extraction is our water, we're the fish, right? We live inside a system that is the only system we've ever known. And yet there's another system just beyond the boundaries of what we see today that could be available to us, right? And Tony's suggesting that for the first time in 12,000 years, we have a way out of that box. So we went through this really fast. There's a lot to this book. It's a very quick read. It's a very short book. There are also now a couple of YouTube video interviews of Jamie and Tony in the last couple of weeks where they're talking about their book a bit more. So I would encourage people that are interested in learning more about this to check those out as well. But I think this has actually been a nice contribution from Jamie and Tony in terms of what does it mean to have these new technologies and where are we headed? They've clearly put a lot of thought into this, and no doubt there's a lot more thinking to be had. But I really appreciate their efforts here in terms of kind of guiding us and leading us a little bit into the future, and sounding the alarm about some of these things. And frankly, we don't have a whole lot of time to think them through.
Yeah, so I'm just trying to bring it back to what's happening now. So the interesting thing, right? The stellar technologies is energy, it's transportation, it's food, intelligence, and labor. And these are all things that Tesla's working on. Tesla's working on energy and transportation. They're working on intelligence and labor. And I've been predicting that at some point, Elon's going to create a company to do food, because if you're thinking about Mars, how do you grow food? That's going to be something they want to deal with, world hunger. I think at some point his brother, Kimball,
well, I think Elon's brother
tailor.
Kimball has thought more about this, yes.
Yeah. When I was at a Giga Texas party, I saw both Elon and Kimball and Franz, and I asked them both the question, are you guys working on solving world hunger? And then they both said yes. Elon went down his path of saying the same thing he's always said, which is there's actually no caloric deficit. It's the distribution, right? I think it's the issue there. And then he stopped and he didn't continue. But then Kimball, I asked him, are you and your brother going to solve world hunger? And he said yes. Clear says yes. So to me, that's going to be something. But it's like, even if they don't, but these are the things that Tesla's working on. And the trending to zero, and Tesla's the lead. So Tesla has, and Elon has, tremendous power to decide how it's going to shape society. And we know that Elon's talking about it. He's thinking about it. He's been saying, how many times has he repeated, right? It's like, I don't even know. You're going to get abundance, right? Sustainable abundance is this new mission for Tesla. Sustainable abundance means that, okay, it sounds like it's like in line with what we're said here. We're going to get abundance, but we want to do it sustainable so that it's not extracting. and that's the best of all worlds. However, it's going to have tremendous impact on society. And therefore, he talks about high income, that we need to find a way. He talks about distributed. Wow. But the other message is that these changes is inevitable. There's no stopping it anymore. They're accelerating at a speed that if you look at all the charts of all disruption, they've all been exponential. So don't be one of those government set stat people who goes, oh, as of today, yeah, it's been exponential so far, but from now on, let's do a straight line. It's not going to happen. It's going to happen sooner than we think. And then if you look at all those charts, it all happened under 10 years, and they're getting faster and faster and faster. So I think the time frame here is not 50 years. We're talking 10 years. And we're seeing it. We're watching it happen in front of our eyes for EVs. We're seeing it happen with energy, AI. And then, of course, we'll see what happens to robots. And you've tracked this. And we're talking Elon and other CEOs of other robotics companies. They've all said the same thing, right? Which is a magnitude change every year. If I make 10 this year, next year I'll make 100. If I make 100 next year, it's 1,000, 10,000, right?
That's right. And that will particularly be possible once we start having machines as labor. And then therefore, it's just machines making machines. Yeah.
It's a tremendous flywheel. So Tesla is the company. Now, I've been saying that I think that you need to invest in the company that's going to make the disruption. If the disruption ends up bad and the future is bad, which I'm still leaning towards, unfortunately, I'm not confident yet. It's humanity. Humanity screws things up. AI, I just can't see how AI is going to be like a utopia. And I hope it is, but we need to talk about it. But
there's no guarantees of any of this. I think that certainly Tony and Jamie are hopeful. They see that, change also has to happen at the human level. The problem is we've been fish in this box for 12,000 years.
Too long. Yep.
We've never known anything different. So this is a massive challenge for each one of us individually, not to mention collectively in terms of how we structure society and government and economics. So, everything has to change. Like this idea that we're just going to get EVs or we're just going to get humanoid robots and that'll be fine. No, everything will have to change. We'll have to create a whole new system around all this, just like we did in the past. But that was 5,000 years ago. Right. We may be facing that kind of challenge now in the next couple of decades.
Yeah. You know how I got to go. But this is great. Appreciate this. Sir, this deserves a lot longer discussion. We wish we had more time to really discuss this and break this down. I'm glad that you brought this up, though, because last week we did a great show that a lot of people saw, Sustainable Abundance. And this really opens it up and makes you realize that what Tesla's doing isn't just these industries, which are massive already, disruptive, but it's going to be the entire humanity.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
So we have a responsibility.
Yeah, it's big stuff. It's important stuff. And the more people that think about it, the better.
Thank you so much, Cern. Follow Cern on his X account at Cern Basher. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Robert.
I've created a website that is the most comprehensive resource for the Tesla investor. Please check it out. Simply go to my website at herbertong.com.